Jonathan thought tonight would be the night he finally had it all. A promotion, admiration, had been watching in silence for 15 years. Then, in front of 700 people, the chairman spoke words that changed everything. Please welcome the owner and CEO of Halcyon.
And just when he thought the night couldn't get worse, Naomi handed him an envelope and quietly said,
"You introduced her as the future, forgot who built your past."
What happened next left the ballroom speechless.
The strange thing about humiliation is that it rarely arrives uninvited. Most times, we walk it to the front door ourselves, smiling. On the night of the promotion gala, Jonathan Reed adjusted his cufflinks 3 separate times, not because he was nervous, because for the first time in 15 years, he believed the world was finally seeing him the way he had always seen himself. Successful, important, indispensable. Outside the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Atlanta, cameras flashed beneath a canopy of crystal lights as luxury cars rolled up one after another. Executives in tailored suits stepped onto the red carpet beside politicians, investors, and media personalities. The annual Vanguard Leadership Gala wasn't simply another corporate event. It was where careers were crowned. And tonight, Jonathan Reed was certain he would leave as the company's newest chief operating officer. At 39, Jonathan had become something of a legend inside Halcyon Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing logistics and technology firms in the Southeast. Employees admired his confidence. Some called it charisma. Others called it ego. Jonathan preferred earned. He often said the same thing to anyone willing to listen. "I built my life from nothing." It was a sentence he repeated so often that he'd begun to believe he had done it, entirely alone. The black Mercedes S-Class stopped beneath the entrance lights. Jonathan stepped out in a midnight blue tuxedo, his beard perfectly lined, his smile practiced. He paused just long enough for photographers to capture him. He enjoyed moments like this, moments where nobody asked questions. Nobody remembered the small apartment in Decatur. Nobody remembered the student loans. And nobody remembered the woman who had quietly stood beside him while he climbed every rung. Inside the car, his phone vibrated. Elena calling. A smile spread across his face. "You miss me already?" he answered. The voice on the other end laughed softly. "You said tonight changes everything." "It does." Elena Santos had entered Jonathan's life 11 months earlier. She was 32, ambitious, effortlessly beautiful, and worked in corporate partnerships. Unlike his wife, she admired every story Jonathan told about himself. She never interrupted him to correct dates or remind him who paid the rent during law school. Most importantly, she made him feel young. "Are you sure?" she asked. Jonathan glanced toward the hotel's massive entrance. "I've never been more sure of anything." "And your wife?" He hesitated. There was a time when hearing the word wife meant something. Back when Naomi still laughed at his terrible jokes. Back when they ate Chinese takeout on the floor because they couldn't afford furniture. Back when she'd sit awake at 2 in the morning, waiting for him to come home from graduate classes. But memories are strange things. They don't disappear. They simply become inconvenient. "Naomi understands this world isn't for her," Jonathan finally said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough to make him uncomfortable. "You really believe that?" "I know it." He ended the call before she could ask another question. What Jonathan didn't know was that 52 floors above the ballroom, in a private executive suite overlooking Atlanta's skyline, his wife was listening to every word. Naomi Reed removed her earpiece and stared through the glass windows. The city glittered beneath the night sky like scattered diamonds. Beside her stood Harold Whitaker, Halcyon's 80-year-old chairman. "He truly has no idea?" Harold asked quietly. Naomi shook her head. "Not anymore." Harold sighed. "I warned your father this arrangement would eventually become complicated." Naomi smiled sadly. "My father always said, people reveal themselves when they think they've reached the top." 3 framed photographs sat on the suite's desk. The first showed a young Naomi beside her father, breaking ground on Halcyon's first warehouse 28 years earlier. The second showed her graduating from Wharton Business School. The third showed her and Jonathan on their wedding day. That photograph remained face down. "There's still time to cancel tonight," Harold said. "No, you don't owe anyone this." Naomi looked toward the ballroom below. "For 15 years, I've watched my husband introduce himself as a self-made man." Her voice remained calm, but Harold recognized the exhaustion behind it. "Tonight, I'm simply giving him the opportunity to tell one final story." Stories like this don't begin with betrayal. They begin with small decisions. The kind people justify because they're tired, or lonely, or convinced they deserve more. 15 years earlier, Jonathan Reed had met Naomi Bennett at a bookstore near Emory University. He was 24 and working 2 jobs. She was 23 and pretending not to be wealthy. Naomi hated being introduced as Richard Bennett's daughter. Richard Bennett's daughter received invitations. Richard Bennett's daughter received opportunities. Richard Bennett's daughter never knew if people loved her or the life attached to her name. So she left Chicago for Atlanta with 1 suitcase and a simple rule: never tell anyone who you are unless they earn the truth. Jonathan earned it slowly. At first, he remembered her coffee order. She remembered that he hated thunderstorms. He talked too much when he was nervous. She listened more than she spoke. 3 years later, they married in a small ceremony with fewer than 40 guests. Jonathan never questioned why. Naomi's side of the family appeared unusually influential. He was too busy building his future. Or perhaps he simply never wanted to ask questions, whose answers might make him feel smaller. By the time Richard Bennett died in 2018, Naomi had quietly inherited controlling ownership of Halcyon Dynamics. She never told Jonathan, not because she wanted to deceive him, because she'd spent years listening to him talk about becoming successful on his own. And every time she considered telling him, he said something that stopped her. "I never want anyone thinking I married money." Or, "Men should build their own legacy." Eventually, silence became easier. Then came success. Then came promotions. Then came distance. And somewhere between ambition and achievement, Jonathan stopped asking his wife how her day had been. "Mr. Reed, over here!" Jonathan smiled as reporters gathered near the ballroom entrance. "How does it feel being the favorite for COO tonight?" He straightened his jacket. "It's humbling." The lie came naturally. "And where is Mrs. Reed this evening?" Jonathan's expression barely changed. "Naomi prefers privacy." That much, at least, was true. Inside the ballroom, nearly 700 guests filled tables beneath towering chandeliers. A live orchestra played softly, while enormous screens displayed Halcyon's achievements over the past year. Jonathan noticed something unusual immediately. His photograph appeared repeatedly. Awards, interviews, magazine covers. He smiled. "They're really laying it on thick tonight," whispered Michael Davenport, Jonathan's closest friend and fellow executive. "You only become COO once." Michael hesitated. "You ever wonder why they moved the announcement to the gala?" Jonathan laughed. "Publicity." "No, I mean specifically tonight." Jonathan waved dismissively. "You overthink everything." Michael lowered his voice. "Harold Whitaker personally requested your attendance." So Harold Whitaker hasn't attended a public event in 8 months. That gave Jonathan pause. Harold Whitaker was practically a myth within the company. Employees spoke about him the way people spoke about old kings. He built empires, ended careers, and, supposedly, knew every significant detail about every executive. Still, Jonathan quickly dismissed the thought. Tonight wasn't about Harold. It was about him. A waiter approached with champagne. "Compliments of the executive office, sir." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "See?" he said, lifting the glass toward Michael. "They're practically announcing it already." Across the ballroom, hidden behind tinted observation glass, Naomi watched her husband laugh. "He still laughs exactly the same way," she said quietly. Harold looked at her. "Do you still love him?" It was the kind of question that sounds simple until someone asks it. Naomi took several seconds before answering. "I love the man I married." "And the man standing downstairs?" She didn't answer, because some questions hurt precisely because they're honest. At 8:13 p.m., Elena arrived. The room noticed immediately. She wore an emerald evening gown that seemed to catch every light in the ballroom. Conversations slowed as she crossed the floor toward Jonathan's table. Michael's face paled. "Oh no." Jonathan stood. "Relax. Tell me you're not doing what I think you're doing." Jonathan smiled. "You said I needed to stop hiding." "At a corporate gala?" "At my promotion gala." Michael looked genuinely alarmed. "Jonathan, your wife, Naomi, isn't coming." The confidence in his voice would have been impressive if it wasn't so misplaced. Elena reached the table. "You look handsome, and you look unforgettable." Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Jonathan," Michael warned. Jonathan ignored him. For months he'd imagined this moment, the beginning of his new life. No more pretending, no more obligations, no more returning home to conversations that felt increasingly unfamiliar. People changed. Marriages ended. That was life. At least, that's what he'd spent the last year telling himself. "You actually brought her," Michael whispered. Jonathan leaned closer. "Tomorrow, none of this will matter." It was a sentence he'd regret before midnight. At 8:47 p.m., the ballroom lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the stage as Harold Whittaker slowly emerged from backstage. The room immediately rose to its feet. Jonathan exchanged a surprised look with Michael. "I told you he never comes out publicly." Harold waited for the applause to settle. "Good evening." His voice carried the kind of authority that couldn't be taught. For 28 years, Halcyon Dynamics has been guided by a simple principle. The massive screens behind him displayed photographs from the company's earliest days. People will always tell you who they are. The challenge is deciding whether to believe them. "Sander Trumbo," Jonathan laughed quietly. "Interesting choice for a corporate speech." Harold continued. "Tonight we celebrate achievement, sacrifice, leadership." The screen shifted. Jonathan's face appeared. The audience applauded. Jonathan smiled. "I'd like to recognize one individual whose contributions have profoundly shaped this company." Michael leaned over. "You're actually getting it." Jonathan could practically feel the title already. Harold paused. "But before we do that, I'd like to invite someone to the stage." The ballroom doors slowly opened. Every conversation stopped. Jonathan turned casually toward the entrance, then froze. Naomi stood beneath the lights wearing a black evening gown. Jonathan had never seen before. The room seemed to part around her, not because of her beauty, because of recognition. Executives stood. Board members straightened immediately. Several people who had never acknowledged. Jonathan suddenly looked at Naomi with unmistakable respect. Jonathan's smile disappeared. "What?" Michael stared at him. "You didn't know?" "Know what?" Naomi walked toward the stage with calm, measured steps. Harold extended his hand. "It is my honor to introduce the majority, owner and chief executive, officer of Halcyon Dynamics." Jonathan's champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor. "Ms. Naomi Bennett Reed." The silence that followed felt almost supernatural. Jonathan looked around the room. No one appeared surprised. Except him. Even Elena had gone pale. Harold stepped aside as Naomi approached the microphone. For 15 years, Jonathan had believed he knew his wife. Suddenly, he wasn't sure he knew her favorite color. Naomi's eyes finally met his across the ballroom. There was no anger in them. That somehow made it worse. "Good evening," she said softly. And Jonathan? Reed realized that every story he'd spent 15 years telling himself had just begun to collapse. Jonathan doesn't yet know that Naomi has seen the messages, paid for Elena's table assignment herself, and changed tonight's agenda 3 hours before the gala began. And in exactly 7 minutes, she is going to ask him to join her on stage in front of 700 people. There are moments in life when time doesn't slow down. It simply refuses to move. Jonathan stood frozen beside his table as 700 pairs of eyes shifted between him and the woman he'd shared a home with for 15 years. His wife. No, that word suddenly felt too small. The CEO. The majority owner. The person every executive in the room had quietly been waiting for. He replayed every conversation they'd had over the past decade. Every time he'd complained about leadership decisions, every time he'd explained business strategy over dinner, every time he'd told Naomi, "People at the top think differently," the memory struck him like a physical blow. 3 months earlier, she'd asked him a simple question while watering the plants in their kitchen. "Do you think power changes people?" He hadn't even looked up from his phone. "No, it reveals them." At the time, he'd thought it was a profound answer. Now it felt like a verdict. Across the ballroom, Naomi remained composed. "Tonight," she continued, "we celebrate not only the achievements of Halcyon Dynamics, but the people who helped build its future." Jonathan noticed something strange. There was no bitterness in her voice, no public humiliation, no anger, just disappointment. And somehow, disappointment was infinitely harder to endure. "I've spent most of my career believing that leadership is less about titles and more about character." The screens behind her displayed photographs of warehouse employees, drivers, and office staff. The people who build companies are often not the people standing under the brightest lights. Jonathan's breathing had become shallow. Michael quietly leaned toward him. "You need to sit down." "No." "Jonathan, when were you going to tell me?" Michael's expression answered the question before he spoke. "You really didn't know." The realization hit Jonathan harder than Naomi's revelation. Everyone knew. Everyone except him. How many conversations had suddenly taken on new meaning? How many promotions? How many invitations? How many opportunities had been influenced by a truth he'd never bothered to uncover? He looked toward Elena. She seemed less interested in him now and far more interested in the exits. Then Naomi said the words that would be replayed across social media by morning. "And I'd like to invite my husband, Jonathan Reed, to join me on stage." The room collectively held its breath. Jonathan felt his legs refuse to cooperate. "You don't have to do this," Michael whispered. But he did. Because pride is a strange thing. Even when it's dying, it insists on making one final speech. The walk to the stage felt impossibly long. Jonathan became painfully aware of every sound. The orchestra had stopped playing. Someone dropped a fork. Camera shutters clicked from every corner of the ballroom. By the time he reached the stage, his confidence had been reduced to muscle memory. Naomi offered him a polite smile. "Thank you for joining me." "Naomi, please." There was nothing hostile in her tone, only finality. She turned back toward the audience. "When my father founded Halcyon Dynamics, he believed companies should be built on trust." The screens behind them changed. To Jonathan's surprise, the first image displayed wasn't a corporate achievement. It was a photograph from 15 years ago. Two young people sitting on the floor of an empty apartment eating takeout from paper containers. The audience smiled softly. Jonathan stared at the image. He'd forgotten that photograph existed. "My husband and I started our marriage with very little," Naomi said. "At least, that's the story we've always told." A few people chuckled. Jonathan couldn't breathe. "Jonathan has spent 15 years working harder than almost anyone I've ever known." He sacrificed weekends, holidays, and countless nights chasing the life he believed we both wanted. For one impossible moment, he thought she was going to forgive him. Then came the pause. But somewhere along the way, success became more important than truth. The room fell silent again. Naomi reached into a small envelope resting on the podium. "I spent a long time asking myself where I failed." Jonathan's heart sank. Was I too quiet? Too patient? Did I make it too easy for him to forget who stood beside him when nobody else believed in him? The questions weren't directed at him. That made them hurt more. Then I realized something. She looked directly at him for the first time since taking the stage. "You cannot compete with a fantasy." Jonathan felt the entire room disappear. When someone falls in love with admiration instead of partnership, they stop seeing the person standing in front of them. He opened his mouth. "Naomi, No, Jonathan. Tonight, I'd like you to listen." The sentence carried 15 years of accumulated silence. The ballroom screens changed once more. Photographs appeared, not of Elena, not of text messages, but of moments. Jonathan asleep at his desk while Naomi covered him with a blanket. Naomi sitting alone at their anniversary dinner waiting for him to arrive. A birthday cake with untouched candles. An empty chair at Thanksgiving. The audience watched in complete silence. "I could stand here and talk about betrayal," Naomi said. But betrayal is rarely the beginning of a story. It's usually the ending of 1,000 smaller choices. Jonathan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Shame. Real shame. Not embarrassment. Not fear of consequences. Shame. "You once told me power reveals who people are." His eyes widened. "You were right." Naomi's voice remained steady. "And tonight, power revealed that I was willing to protect your pride for 15 years. A few people quietly lowered their eyes. While you were willing to sacrifice our marriage for 11 months of feeling admired." Jonathan finally looked toward Elena. She couldn't meet his gaze. Naomi noticed. "Miss Santos, thank you for joining us this evening." The entire ballroom turned toward Elena. "I understand Jonathan introduced you to several people tonight." Elena stood slowly, clearly wishing the floor would open beneath her. Naomi offered her a surprisingly kind smile. "I hope you know this isn't your fault entirely." Jonathan stared at his wife in disbelief. People can only believe the stories they're told. Then Naomi delivered the sentence that would become the title of every article written about the gala. "My husband introduced you as the future." She paused. "I'd like to introduce you to the past, present, and owner of the company paying for tonight's dinner." An audible gasp swept across the room. Even Harold Whitaker smiled. Jonathan closed his eyes. There are humiliations that happen privately, and then there are humiliations that become lessons. The next 10 minutes passed like a dream Jonathan would spend years trying to forget. He attempted to speak twice. Neither attempt succeeded. Finally, Naomi reached into the envelope once more. 3 weeks ago, my attorneys prepared these documents." She handed him a folder. He didn't need to open it. He already knew. "Divorce papers." The words barely escaped his lips. "I didn't file them immediately." "Why?" It was the first honest question he'd asked all evening. Naomi considered him carefully. "Because I was waiting." "For what?" "To see if you'd remember who you were." That answer broke something inside him. "I know this isn't the man I married, Jonathan." Tears had begun forming in his eyes. "I can change." "No." Her response wasn't cruel. It was simply honest. "You can become someone else. Change suggests you'll become who you used to be." The room remained completely silent. And some people only exist in memories. 3 months later, Jonathan Reed lived alone in a condominium overlooking the Chattahoochee River. The divorce had been finalized quietly. Contrary to online rumors, Naomi hadn't taken everything. She didn't need to. Jonathan kept his savings, his car, and enough dignity to rebuild a life. He also kept something far less comfortable: perspective. He resigned from Halcyon Dynamics 2 weeks after the gala. Not because Naomi asked him to, because every hallway reminded him of who he'd become. Elena left shortly afterward. As it turned out, admiration has a remarkably short lifespan when separated from ambition. Jonathan started teaching business ethics at a local university. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every semester, he began with the same sentence: "Success has a cost." The problem is that most people don't realize they're paying until the bill arrives. His students assumed it was something he'd read in a book. It wasn't. Meanwhile, Naomi expanded Halcyon internationally. Under her leadership, the company launched scholarship programs, employee housing initiatives, and mentorship opportunities for first-generation professionals. She never remarried, at least not during the years that followed. When interviewers occasionally asked about her personal life, she always gave the same answer: some chapters deserve gratitude even if they don't deserve another ending. And perhaps that was the greatest difference between them. Jonathan spent years trying to become someone important. Naomi spent years helping others become someone important. Only one of them succeeded. 5 years after the gala, Jonathan received an invitation. No sender, no explanation, just an address. Curiosity eventually won. He arrived at a newly constructed community center on Atlanta's west side. A plaque stood near the entrance: the Reed Bennett Leadership Center. His hands trembled. Inside, he found Naomi speaking with a group of scholarship recipients. She looked almost exactly the same, maybe peace ages differently. Their eyes met across the room. "Hello, Jonathan. You named it after both of us?" She smiled gently. "It wasn't all bad." He laughed quietly. "No, it wasn't." They stood in comfortable silence. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. "You owed me one a long time ago." "I know." Naomi looked toward the students laughing nearby. "My father used to say that life gives everyone two opportunities." "What are they?" "The chance to become who they want to be, and the chance to live with who they became." Jonathan considered the words carefully. "And which one did I get?" She smiled. "That depends. What did you do after the applause stopped?" For the first time in many years, Jonathan didn't have an immediate answer. And perhaps that was the point. Sometimes betrayal doesn't destroy a person. Sometimes it introduces them to themselves. And sometimes the most painful thing in the world isn't losing someone who loved you. It's realizing they spent years loving a version of you that no longer existed. If this story made you think differently about success, loyalty, or the people who stand beside us when nobody is watching, let me know where you're listening from, because somewhere tonight, someone is choosing between being admired and being known.